Hello, fellow healthcare executives. I'm Chris Coleman with Prosper 3J2, and today we continue our short series on physician compensation. And I know we've talked a little bit about the general life cycle of a contract and how you engage in these. And last week you talked about agreeing to terms. Today we're going to actually talk about constructing the agreement itself, the contract. So, one quick disclaimer, I'm not an attorney. And therefore, I would always tell you, first and foremost, before entering into a physician arrangement, that you contact legal counsel. I'm just giving you a little bit of my experience and hopefully give you some helpful tips today. So, when you're constructing a physician arrangement, you always have to take into account a couple things. The first is I cannot construct this agreement based on the volume or the value of referrals. Come straight from the Stark Law. It also must be consistent with fair market value. And it also has to be commercially reasonable. Now, I'm not going to dive into really the details of those three, but you probably already know that. But it has to meet that test, what we call the big three. And once it meets those big three, it still has to satisfy one of the many, sometimes multiple, exceptions under Stark, because Stark is an interesting law that's written in such a way that all physician arrangements are deemed to be illegal on the outset until you can find an exception for it to fit into. It's a little bit different in the way that you come to that kind of agreement compared to other laws. So here's a few tips that I want to give you that I think are super helpful. The first, your legal department, your counsel, whether internal or outside, they are your friends. You need to be talking to them early and often because they should be able to help you really navigate the nuances of these physician arrangements. You have to work together. If you do not have the legal department just close to you, you're going to make a mistake. Now, conversely, I would tell my legal colleagues the same thing. Compliance is your friend, and while you may be looking at the actual language of a contract, your compliance professional is looking at the processes, is looking at really, I would say, the more totality of the arrangement, and that's pretty important. So tip number one, absolutely make sure that your legal colleagues are close to you, that they're your friend, work together. Number two, you absolutely need to limit the number of people who can create a contract. Now, this looks really different depending on the size and scope of your organization. If you're a much larger organization, like some that I've worked for, you've kind of hardwired this into maybe an electronic approval process in which the contracts are actually built into a contracting system. If you're a smaller system or an independent physician practice or something like that, then you still may be handling contracts by paper or using a little bit of DocuSign. Either way, the people who can create the contract, the smaller the number, the better. Once this gets too broad and too many people can have their sort of hands into that pot, the more opportunities you have for a mistake. Also, another tip, creativity is your enemy. So your legal colleagues are your friend, creativity is your enemy. When I hear someone say, "Hey, I've got an idea for a creative contract," even had a colleague years ago tell me, "Hey, Chris, I want to talk to you about this physician payment scheme." And my eyes went wide open. Scheme? What are you talking about? And he said, "Yes, I came up with something really creative." Well, it turns out by scheme, what he meant was a contract. But I told him using that term probably was not in his best interest or the best interest of our organization. So when you think of creativity, again, that can really get you into hot water because the Stark Law is very, very specific. How do you avoid creativity? Well, here's another tip. Use standardized templates. Again, this is going to come from your your colleagues. It's going to have the content, the language. It's going to have all of these components that need to be in each and every physician arrangement. If you keep people from creating individual contracts, creative contracts, if you will, then your chances of making a misstep really go down. If you use standardized language, standardized contracts, standardized templates. Now, that doesn't mean that comp is always going to be the same, but the way you go about doing a physician arrangement, well, you want it to look the same for the most part. The other thing I would tell you is include stakeholders in the process. Now, this is a struggle for many organizations. And when I say stakeholders, well, who's the stakeholders? Well, we often think of the operations team that's trying to get the deal done. Yes, that is one stakeholder. The legal department, compliance, that's another stakeholder. Also true. But what about the people who actually have to live with the contract? I find that the finance department is one of the greatest stakeholders, one of the greatest collaborators to have at the table when you do these. And why? Because they're the ones that actually have to pay it. And they may be able to tell you, we can't execute this how you've constructed. And I can't tell you how many times that I've seen that where a contract is absolutely legal, but to execute it is incredibly difficult. So you always want to have your finance team at the table to tell you, hey, if you're pulling these RVUs or that RVUs, can we even get to that data? Anytime that you have to do something manual and you have manual intervention, the risk just goes up. Now, there's one question that you should always ask as a compliance professional when related to physician arrangements. And this should be the one that you're asking of those stakeholders, in particular the legal department. It's one that I've asked many times over the years, and this is that question. Just because we could doesn't mean we should. I have absolute confidence in my legal counsel, your legal counsel, that they can construct an absolutely legal physician arrangement. But the question is, can we keep it that way? Can it be operationalized in such a way that it remains that way? Can we execute it? Can we pay it correctly? So I do think we should always ask that question. Just because we could doesn't mean we should. And let's dive into that. So in closing today, I just want to say thank you for this time. Maybe you can take some of those tips and they'll be helpful to you. Remember, if you've got a question that you would like answered or a comment, send me a private message and we'll answer it on next week's episode of the Compliance Compass.